Board's going to start in about 3 minutes. 3 minutes.
Alright. And then when it switches over to me, I'll
Okay, let's get started. People in the back of the room, please take your conversations out to the hallway so we can get the South Atlantic Board started. All right. My name is Pat Gear. I'm the chairman of the South Atlantic Board, and welcome here this afternoon, and we'll try to make this as quick and painless as possible for all of you. The first order of business is approval of the agenda. Are there any additions or changes to the agenda? Seeing none, consider it approved. Second item is approval of the minutes from the May 2014 meeting. Any changes, any modifications? Hearing none, we'll consider that approved. The next item is public comment. Do we have anybody who, nobody came to me at all. Does anybody have any public comment? Oh, we're moving right along. Great. Okay. Item number 4 is an update of our triggers for spot and Atlantic croaker exercises. That's going to be done by Harry Rickenbach. Harry, it's all yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to quickly go through the current trigger analysis for both Atlantic croaker and spot. Starting with croaker, this was originally and still is a assessment trigger. It was designed to initiate a stock assessment in a non-assessment year. There's only one hard trigger. It's the commercial and recreational landings. If either of those drop below 70% of the previous 2-year average, that's the hard trigger that actually initiates a stock assessment. The TC also reviews biological data, commercial and recreational effort, and some independent indices. And if the TC feels that those are showing something alarming, we can also recommend that a stock assessment be done ahead of schedule. As I mentioned, the hard triggers are both commercial and recreational landings. The way it would work for this year is the 2013 landings would need to be less than 70% of the average of the 2011 and 12 landings. And going through those, we'll look at the commercial first. The red bars on this figure indicate years in which the trigger would have tripped. As you can see, 2013 did not trip. The landings in 2013 were, I think, just under 10 million pounds. And the average for 2011 and 12 were 11.9 million pounds. You will notice in the red oval area that the landings have been declining steadily for the last 10 years, but never at a rate quick enough to trip the trigger. And this is something that concerns the TC with this particular trigger, is that you could have this continue on and we would never actually have it trip. One thing, if you would look real quick, between 2010 and 2011, you'll see there's quite a big drop. That actually almost tripped that year. Later on, when we're looking at individual states' landings and effort, I'll point out to you something with North Carolina that'll show what part of that is. It still would have declined, but some of that is due to a reduction in effort in the fly net fishery in North Carolina. Looking at the recreational landings, again, same thing. The red bars are the years it would have tripped. 2012 and 2013 both increased, so the trigger did not trip in 2013. You can see there are a couple times in recent history that it would have. Okay, now looking at this is commercial catch and effort for the major gears for Virginia. The next few graphs will be similar to this one, where the bars are the annual landings and the black squares are the effort data. And for both Virginia and North Carolina, which will be the next slide, in general you'll see that the landings and effort sort of mostly increased through the late 1990s, held steady for a while, and then decreased through the end of the 2000s, and in recent years have kind of started to level off at a low level. If you would do a catch per unit effort on this, that's what you would see. The reason we didn't is this effort is actually positive trips. We have no way of knowing which trips were targeting croaker and caught none. And for North Carolina, again, similar pattern for most of the fisheries where you have a little bit of a decrease in landings in recent years. You can see the second panel down is the fly net. And apparently at the end of the 2010 season, the hurricane season disrupted or changed the inlet in such a way that the fly boats have trouble getting in and out now, so that effort has actually been reduced for that reason. And actually in 2013 they only made one trip. So that would be approximately almost 3 million pounds. If you look at the previous 3-year average, it was about 3 million pounds per year that was kind of lost just due to potentially lost for effort only. But even if you add that back on, every year still declines. 2010 would decline from 11, just not to the same magnitude. Florida, these are smaller gears. If you look at on the margin, this is in thousands of pounds and hundreds of trips, as opposed to millions of pounds and thousands of trips of the other two states. These gears tend to track effort and landings track together with the hook and line. The catch per unit effort would have increased the past few years and been more similar to the late 90s. But other than that, it follows kind of a similar trend where it's kind of more leveled off. Again, these are smaller fisheries, so they're more mobile and not showing as much of a trend. Okay, the next several slides will be the independent indices. This one is the VIMS trawl survey. This is a juvenile survey done in Virginia's portion of the Chesapeake Bay and their tidal tributaries. All these indices that were the next 4 indices are the ones that were used in the 2010 stock assessment. That's why the TC focuses on these. The black line with the blue diamonds are that's the one that was actually used, the formulation of the index that was used in the last assessment. VIMS personnel looked at it, and these couple of peaks, especially that one around 2009, were determined to be large catches from the bay that aren't typical. So they also ran the index just for the rivers. That's that olive green line. And you'll see it does take out a couple of those really extreme peaks. But you still have, if you look at the last 3 years, 2011 would have been a very low year. 2012 looks like a very good year class, and then it's kind of average this past year in 2013. The next one is the North Carolina trawl survey. This is also a juvenile trawl survey. There's a little more variability in this one. They don't match up perfectly, but if you look at the last 3 years, you still have that same very low 2011, high 2012, and a little bit above average 2013. Of course, North Carolina also shows a very, very strong 2010 year class that didn't show up in Virginia. And this is one of the reasons why the TC included both of these, is it's 2 of the major nursery areas, and you could have differences between them. So when you combine them together, you get a better picture of the overall potential recruitment. But again, both of those were above average. The next 2 are the offshore trawl surveys, NIMS and CMAP. Both of these surveys do catch all age classes from 0 through large adults, but it primarily catches age 3 and under, actually under 3. So it is a little more skewed towards younger fish as opposed to older fish, where the commercial landings are generally age 3 plus. So they are focused on slightly different portions of the adult population. You can see it's showing a different trend than the landings. It's increased in recent years. The last 2 years of decline, but 2013 is still above the long-term mean for the for the NIMS trawl. CMAP is a little more variable, up and down, above and below the mean. Again, the last couple years have been relatively high. 2012 was the highest year on record, and a decline in 2013, but still well above the long-term mean. I'm just going to go ahead and go right through spot, and then I'll take any questions on both if that's fine. The spot triggers are a little different. This was designed as a management trigger. If this one should trigger, the PRT is to recommend to the board to take management action. That management action is not defined, but it's just to be recommended to the board. And this one works if either one, you need 2 indices to go below the 10th percentile of its long-term mean, and one of which has to be fishery independent. And you can see they are the commercial and recreational landings, the NIMP and CMAP trawl, and the Maryland Juvenile Seine Survey. First, we'll look at the landings. This is both the commercial and recreational landings. The commercial is the solid blue line. Recreational is your red dashed line. Pretty clearly, the landings were much higher. They've always been variable. That's not too surprising with spot. It's a short-lived, highly variable recruitment species. You can see it declines and kind of doesn't hit the same highs once you get into the 90s. Then it's declined through the 2000s. Recently, it's been cycling up and down annually, with the downturns becoming lower and lower. Both 2012 and 2013 were below the 10th percentile. So for this particular index, it is trip, but that you need another one to trip before the actual trigger itself goes into effect. And you can see the recreational landings, same thing, they're even more variable. You do have a big peak there around 2007, and it increased in 2013, but it's still below the long-term mean, but above the 10th percentile. For the trawl surveys, these next two will be the same two trawl surveys for croaker and the nymphs and the CMAP. There's a little bit of an increasing trend with the nymphs trawl. You can see there's a low point in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and a couple of large peaks after. 2013 was 3 times lower than 2012, but 2012 was such a high year, you're still well above the 10th percentile. So this one is not going to trip. Similarly with CMAP, more variable. There's not a real trend with CMAP, but it also was above the 10th percentile, and not fully agreeing with the commercial landings, which is going the other direction. This is the Maryland Juvenile Sane Survey. And we picked one juvenile survey for this one because we actually did some correlation analysis, and the different juvenile indices actually tracked each other very well through much of the range, particularly the Mid-Atlantic North, and the Maryland Sane Survey had the longest time series. As you can see, it was very high in the 1970s, basically cycling up and down as you would expect, but getting lower and lower into the 2000s. We've now had a couple of big peaks in there, but we did go below the 10th percentile in 2011, rebounded a little in 12, dropped again in 13, but maintained just above the 10th percentile. So it did not trip either. So basically the spot trigger did not trip, but the commercial landings are very, very, very low. They're below the 10th percentile. Recreational remains fairly low, and the juvenile index is near but not at those low levels, while the two offshore surveys are fine, so the trigger does not trip. Both the croaker TC and the spot PRT, don't feel either one of these triggers do a great job of tracking these species through time and initiating management at the appropriate time, particularly the croaker, since it was actually designed as a assessment trigger. It's looking for a sharp decline, which what we would really want to probably take management on is more of a sustained long decline. Also, they're single year triggers. In other words, if you have a really bad year, it could trigger, and you're not really looking back at what you had before. This is one of the reasons why this PRT and the TC prefer the traffic light, because then you have multiple years, 2 years in case of spot, 3 in the case of croaker, where you have to have a certain proportion of red. Those proportions of red, of course, are going to encompass multiple surveys. So it's more of a general decline you would have to have for those to initiate it, and gives you a better picture of the long-term situation, not just the short-term. And they also, both of these indices, because they're based on either the long-term average or just a short-term average, can continually decline, and basically it's a moving target. You keep getting a lower and lower benchmark you have to hit. That's all I have. I'm willing to take whatever questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Harry. Any questions for Harry? Yes, Gary?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Harry. Harry, a question for you. Outside of the abundance estimates from the various surveys, I was curious. I've heard word of some distribution of croaker in particular northward, and I know this. The ASMFC's had discussions about flounder and some other species shifting distribution. Do any of your surveys pick up on a change in distribution, geographic distribution of that particular species? And if you can address that, I don't know whether the New Jersey or New York folks I've heard even stories that party boats are targeting them up there now. I'm just curious about how the adults are distributing themselves.
We didn't look at it in detail, but a brief look at the landings, both commercial and recreational, don't show a large shift. There's not a lot of adult inshore surveys. We have the 2 trawl surveys. The NIMS survey does go pretty far north. It's not showing any significant. We didn't really look for site by site. You could go strata by strata, I guess, and look over time to see if there is a shift. My feeling is I don't think you're going to see one based on the limited time I've spent looking at that data. But we don't have a real good data set anywhere that's going to show us definitively yes or no. There are some, as you mentioned, anecdotal reports with guys catching spot in New York that don't usually catch them for a year or two. Some of that I think is abated, but there are some situations where those things are arising, but nothing concrete.
Any other questions, comments? Russ?
Yeah, just to follow up with Marty's question, we haven't really seen any changes up in New Jersey. I mean, if you get a few winters that are somewhat warm, we'll have an explosion of young a year up there. We get some good spawning, and then that year class burns out, and then it goes back to where it was. But we haven't seen any major jump. It's pretty much followed the coastwide assessment as Harry's showing. So.
Okay. Thank you, Russ. Again, thank you very much, Harry. Moving on to item number 5. Kirby's going to give us an overview of the Addendum 1 for Spot, the Omnibus Amendment, and the Draft Addendum number 2 for Atlantic Croaker. And he's going to do both a review of the addenda as well as the summary of the public comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, as this is what will be approximately the 3rd time we've reviewed the draft addendum. The main things I'll try to focus on are the public comment, as well as an update to the traffic light that encompasses 2013 data, as well as some of the surveys that were requested that be considered with the traffic light. So. Just for background, the board initiated the draft addendum in February of this year. The board reviewed and approved the draft addendum for public comment in May. Public comment was open from May 28th until July 2nd. And today the board is tasked with considering a final action on the addendum. For the statement of the problem, I'll just briefly mention, off of what Harry had said through the trigger exercises, this process came about through concern by the technical committee and the plan review team that the management triggers were not adequately representing and accounting for trends that we were seeing in the fishery. And associated with that, there wasn't an effective management program to respond to these trends. So. For both species, they're in terms of the understanding their life history and how these things might be playing a role. They're both small cyanid forage species. They migrate seasonally along the coast. For croaker, the last coastwide benchmark assessment we have was 2010, whereas for spot, we've never had a coastwide benchmark stock assessment. Again, the triggers have been concerning to the TC and PRT for some time. The other element is the degree of bycatch for both species, and having not been able to fully quantify that in previous assessments has prevented the spot one from being conducted and thrown caution and concern to the ability to assess the true abundance of croaker as well. So the TC and PRT has been using the traffic light approach to assess these species, and that's what this addendum offers. Again, the main thing you're looking for here is that the proportion of green, the increasing of that is a positive trend away from the long-term mean of the reference period, whereas an increase of the proportion of red is a decrease from that long-term mean. These are the 2 characteristics that we had included in the addendum. Later on, I'll highlight some of the traffic light characteristics that were not included, just to give some more robust understanding of trends we're seeing in the fishery and why they were not included at the time. Again, this is so the two for croaker are the harvest and the adult abundance. The same are for spot, the harvest characteristic, and the adult abundance. And then again, the addendum offered three management options, the first being status quo, that would not move beyond what the current management triggers are. The second two would be using the traffic light approach with a management framework response, the first one being coast-wide measures that would be initiated based on either one or both of the population characteristics exceeding their 30% threshold. The third one is would be taking state-by-state measures based on those population characteristics. I'm going to skip down through these unless there were any further questions folks had about those management options as they were listed in the addendum that was approved. And I'll skip on to the public comment.
Are there any questions?
None.
Oh, okay.
Slide 18. So for the public comment, there were public hearings held in June for the states of Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia. Across those four states, 73 people attended. There were commissioners in attendance for a few of those as well. In terms of the written comments submitted, we had approximately 117 written comments submitted. 116 of them were form letters. So taken in consideration with them and the comments shared at those public hearings, we had 176 comments provided. For those form letters, predominantly they were received from the state of North Carolina. And the one group that provided public comment was the North Carolina Fisheries Association. In terms of the public comments, preference for the management options included in the addendum, majority of the public comment were in favor of option one, status quo, for the following reasons. The first one being there was concern listed over the data used in the traffic light. This ranged from which surveys were being included to the surveys that were included, effectiveness in accounting for abundance, as well as the survey scope and lack of local area representation. A lack of effort data included in the commercial landings, as well as the role of market forces possibly impacting commercial landings. Many voicing support for option one requested that NEMAP be included in the traffic light, and until done so, that the traffic light nor the proposed management frameworks should be used. And as I said later on, I'll show what the technical committee and PRT looked at in terms of NEMAP and the traffic light. The next item that was hit on a lot was the cyclical nature of the abundance for both species, with regards to environmental factors playing a role in the abundance. For a number of comments received, the view was that management measures would not effectively curb or promote abundance because of that element. And finally, the proposed management measures that were under consideration in options 2 and 3, many took issue with those, notably the size limits that were listed, and what were viewed as the impractical management measures given the life history of both species. Other concerns was the potential economic impact that could come to fishermen and bait shop owners given the use of these measures. For those who were in favor of the traffic light approach, reasons given for in preference of it, specifically in terms of option 3, was the flexibility for states to respond in a local context based on their fishery and what was most appropriate. And in terms of trying to consider whether the population characteristics that were included in the addendum, in terms of people being in favor of the traffic light approach, those who were said that they were preferred the multiple characteristics approach rather than using one single characteristic. The idea being that with more information, more accurate decisions could be made. So that's the summary of what the public comments we received are. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer those now.
Joe.
Well, I just want to make a comment on the public comment. After the public hearing in Virginia, we got quite a few calls in the office about the addendum, and what we found was there was confusion in the way it was laid out. They took the tables that are on page 9 and page 12 of the addendum and took those measures in there, such as closing the state areas from September through November, or shutting down gillnet fishery for 2 months, as actually being what we were voting on today. So that's what produced a lot, I know at least for Virginia, a lot of negative comments. So once we explained that that wasn't what this was about, and it was about the trigger, and it was about, you know, options such as state by state versus coastal, there was a little bit more agreement to it. We even met with our Finfish committee one more time, the same group that Kirby came and presented to, and they had an understanding of it better the second time around. But those two tables seemed to have caused some concern that that's what we were doing today, was enacting measures to close. And so we've kind of dispelled that. I don't know if the other states had the same issue, but we did find that in Virginia, and since we've gotten a lot better public feedback on this document. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? All right, well,
Show an update of what the traffic.
he's going to show, we're going to see an update of the 2013 numbers, preliminary numbers.
Correct. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Moving down through the presentation, we decided the technical committee and the plan review team wanted to update the traffic light approach for both Spot and Croaker to better inform the board's decision making. And so the first one is looking at the harvest characteristic with regards to updated information, including the 2013 landings. And again, this is the harvest characteristic is a composite of both the commercial landings and the recreational harvest. The proportion of red actually increased for 2013. Again, this mimics the trend that was shown in Harry's presentation on the triggers. But with regards to the management options proposed, it's important to note that this exceeds that 30% threshold for 3 consecutive years. If one population characteristic were to be utilized as opposed to multiple, this would trip and would require a management response. Regarding the adult abundance characteristic for Atlantic croaker, the 2013 data update, while 2012 had a significant increase in terms of the proportion of green, 2013 had a decrease in that, but still with a higher percentage than what the long-term average is. While the juvenile abundance was not included in the addendum because of concerns that the technical committee and plan review team raised regarding what a juvenile abundance could actually demonstrate for the population on a whole, this was important, I thought, to present as it was raised that concerns that the local characteristics in the states of Virginia and North Carolina were not accurately or effectively being encompassed in the traffic light approach. But what the juvenile abundance does show is actually very similar to what you see in the adult abundance. So while it doesn't cover the same area, it is very much in line with what the adult abundance has been showing in recent years. And again, for the juvenile abundance, what we were using for these indexes was the North Carolina 195 program, as well as the VIMS juvenile index. The next item that was raised during the public comment period was the need to use NEMAP in assessing both croaker and spot. As was raised specifically at the Virginia public hearing, NEMAP is now essentially conducting trawl surveys in the interstrata that had formerly been used by the NIMS trawl survey. So the technical committee and plan review team examined that data and tried to understand it in the context of the traffic light approach. So what this graph is showing you is kind of the same types of analysis that we've been doing with the other indices, where you essentially create an average for the time series that you have and then monitor that based on the green, yellow, red approach, right? Green being increasingly good relative to that long-term mean, red being a decrease. One of the confounding things that comes out of the NEMAP survey is that because it's for a short period of time, the average is kind of at an artificial level. As you see, for 2012, there was a huge spike in the catch for that year, and in turn, it raises that average up quite a bit. If you take out the 2012 year, it also then changes that average significantly. But that short time period is what was most concerning in terms of trying to account for it in relation to the other indices that were looked at, where the reference period dated back to the 1990s. So what the TC felt could be done, at least on a preliminary level, was trying to incorporate it from 2007 onward. Trying to go backwards is a little bit more difficult because you're not essentially you're not collecting data in the same areas going back in history, but moving forward you can kind of look at it. And the important thing to note here is that we tried to look at what the traffic light approach for croaker would be with NEMAP included and with NEMAP not included. So the first shows what the traffic light composite looks like with NEMAP data included. The second slide shows it removed. What it actually shows is that for this time period, the NEMAP data would indicate that there would be a decreasing trend in abundance. So the technical committee we're still working to try to calibrate and make sense of how we could try to go back in time a little bit more and further incorporate these two surveys through calibrations. But for the time being, the short time period that NEMAP has been in effect confounds the ability of really assessing it in the way we're able to with these other surveys. In terms of spot, the harvest characteristic for 2013 saw an increasing proportion of green while a significant decrease in the proportion of red. This would make total sense given that both the commercial and recreational harvests doubled what they were the previous year. And they remain below the 30% threshold for that 2-year period, so there would not be tripping in like dissimilar to what would be happening with croaker if one population characteristic was utilized for management action. In terms of the adult abundance with the surveys that we used, which again was the NIMS groundfish trawl survey and CMAP, what we see is an increasing trend in abundance for the years of 2010 up to 2012, with a slight decrease in 2013. In spite of that, it's not significant enough of a decline for there to be an increasing in the proportion of red. Therefore, it's not moving, while it's moving away from those highs that it had been, it's still not below the long-term mean average. Again, similar to Croker, we didn't incorporate the juvenile surveys for the addendum, but I wanted to show to the board, just in the context of understanding local representation. For the Maryland Sane survey, the proportion of red has been increasing over the last 3 years in the Bay for the section that this survey captures. And while it helps give more context to Maryland, it doesn't quite mesh up with what we see across the coast, which is why we were more interested in applying the adult characteristic and trying to determine management options. So, if there are any questions about that, I can answer them.
Adam.
Just one, going back to the first slide out of these you showed with the traffic light approach for 2013 for Croker's. I believe, and I may have misheard you, I believe that I heard you say that with the addendum that would, because there was the one factor that would have triggered management action, but I believe the addendum contemplates an option for a singular population characteristic should cause action. So I know we had some discussion about this at the last meeting. I believe there's some verbiage in here that's been clarified that I thought improved my understanding of it, which I appreciate, but perhaps I just misheard you, but I just wanted to get clarification on that based on the discussion from the last meeting.
Yes, thank you, Adam. So off of your comments at the last meeting, we did move to change the language in the addendum so that under each of the options 2 and 3, there is the sub-option of choosing to apply either one characteristic to essentially cause management response. If one of those two characteristics fell below the 30% threshold for that period of time, or if you would have to require both of the population characteristics. So in that way, the addendum offers an opportunity for either management to be triggered on this one characteristic, or for both having to fall below the 30% threshold for the given time period. So it's an option that either it could not, or it could, depending on the board's pleasure.
Follow-up.
Okay, so then to clarify that, the 2A options that use the word should and the 2B options that use the word would require, are they actually equivalent to that end? Is should and would require the same? I'm looking at page 7 to start with for the Croker. 2A says management action should be enacted, which to me means it may not be enacted. It means we... So, again, I just want to get clarification on that.
Yes, thank you, Adam. I believe it's a typo that says that the would-should discrepancy that you're referring to.
So both options should read management action would... Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks for catching that, Adam. That was a good find. Any other questions or comments for Kirby? Okay, well, we've been at this for 3 meetings now. And so I think, Mr. Grist, you're up. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to offer a motion. I'll provide a copy of this up to Tony. Motion is to adopt option 3, the state-by-state management framework, and option 3B, the multiple population characteristics criteria, for both draft addendum 1 to the spot omnibus amendment and draft addendum 2 to amendment 1 of the Atlantic Croker FMP. That's my motion.
Seconded by Mr. Woodward. Any discussion on this? Let's keep this simple. Any opposition to this?
Not quite the way he put it.
Need the motion read. Okay. Dr. Daniel, did you have something to say?
I was just going to say, if this passes, let's do eels real quick.
The kinder and friendlier committee. Any comments? Do you want me to read it before we have any? You want me to read it right now? Okay. Well, I was going to ask if there's any other comments. And hearing none. Oh, I love this committee. This is great. All right. Move to adopt option 3, the state-by-state management framework, and sub-option 3B, the multiple population characteristics criteria for draft addendum 1 to the omnibus amendment for spot, and draft addendum 2 to amendment 1 of the Atlantic Croker FMP, motion by Mr. Grist, second by Mr. Woodward. We'll make this form. All those in favor, raise your right hand. All those opposed, do the same. Carried unanimously. Thank you, gentlemen. Okay. We all set? All right. Moving on. Kirby's going to give us some reviews of state compliance and FMP reviews for both Croker and Red Drum.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I'll go through these fairly quickly. For Croker, this is covering much of the ground that has been discussed in the triggers and traffic light. For Atlantic Croker, in terms of the status of the fishery, from New Jersey through the east coast of Florida, 2013 estimated landings were at 13.9 million pounds. This represents a 66% decline in the total harvest since the peak of 41.2 million pounds in 2001. The commercial and recreational fisheries harvested approximately 71% and 29% of the total, respectively. In looking at recreational harvest, the 2013 landings were estimated at 7.7 million fish and 3.9 million pounds, showing a slight increase from the 2012 numbers. Virginia was responsible for about 56% of the 2013 recreational landings and numbers of fish, followed by Maryland at 15% and New Jersey at 11%. In 2013, recreational anglers released 14 million fish, which is higher than the 10-year average of approximately 11.8 million fish. In looking at state compliance and de minimis status, the PRT finds that all states have fulfilled the requirements of Amendment 1. For de minimis, the criteria is that for either fishery, the 3-year average must be less than 1% of the coastwide total. The states of Delaware, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida requested de minimis and all qualified for such. Status does not exempt those states from any of the compliance requirements. It's the board's pleasure to determine the status of these states and approve them for de minimis status, and as well as the FMP review. Thank you.
Okay. Any questions or comments? And we need a motion. And I need a motion. Adam.
Move to accept the compliance reports and approve the de minimis requests as presented.
Okay. And I guess we're getting that up there now. Guess Melissa's getting it up there now. She doesn't have a screen. Okay. Can you put that back? Okay, do I get a second on that? Second by Joe Grist. Okay, the motion is move to accept the compliance reports for Atlantic Croker, approve the de minimis request as presented, and motion by Adam and Joe. Seeing any opposition to that? Seeing none? Can do it that way, Joe? Okay. Consider it carried and approved. Okay, now we have to do red drum, right?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll go through the red drum F&P review now. So the 2014 update, which is landings and information up through 2013, total red drum landings in 2013, as showed it in the shaded area, were approximately 3.1 million pounds, a 69.6 increase from 2012, and an 88% increase above the previous 10-year average. Recreational harvest represents about 87% of the landings in 2013, which is down from 2012. In 2013, the 51% of the total landings came from the southern region, where the fishery is exclusively recreational. The majority of the commercial landings came from North Carolina in 2013. Historically, North Carolina and Florida were the major commercial harvesters, with Florida now as game fish status. In the recreational fishery, recreational harvest increased from approximately 500,000 fish, which is a 1.7 million pounds in 2012, to approximately 760,000 fish in 2013, which is approximately 2.7 million pounds. The 2013 harvest represented a 50% increase in the numbers and a 58% increase in the pounds from the previous 10-year average. Recreational releases have shown increasing trend over the time series. The proportion of releases decreased slightly in 2013, down from 91% to 81%. But the overall number of fish released decreased as well from 5.7 million pounds to 3.2 million pounds. It's estimated that 8% of the released fish die as a result of being caught, resulting in an estimate of 263,000 fish that died, resulting in dead discards in 2013. With regards to state compliance, there are no specific criteria defined. The states of New Jersey and Delaware requested de minimis status. The PRT compares essentially the state's 2-year average to the total landings of the coastwide. For New Jersey, that constituted less than 0% of the coastwide landings, and for Delaware, it was 0.17%. Status doesn't exempt these states from any of the compliance requirements, but essentially these states, in spite of not having criteria, the PRT finds that these states would essentially be able to qualify for such. While it's not a compliance issue, North Carolina, due to an overage in their 2013 to 2014 commercial fishery, would have to take a reduction in the subsequent year as the overage of the 250,000 pound quota was exceeded by approximately 12,000 pounds. As such, that would be deducted in the 2014-2015 commercial fishery season. The PRT finds that all the states have fulfilled the requirements of Amendment 2. So the recommendations are that the continued moratorium in the EEZ, consider the de minimis requests of New Jersey and Delaware, and consider the prioritized research monitoring recommendations as outlined in the compliance report. Jeff will be going through momentarily the terms of reference that we'll be building off of some of these research items that have been built into the compliance report for a while now. But if there aren't any other, there's no other items for me, but if you have any questions, please let me know. Thanks.
Lewis.
not a question, but a explanation. The red drum fishery in North Carolina opened September 1, and in fairly surprising fashion, the quota was caught up in about 2 months at a 10-fish bycatch allowance. We are doing some investigations into those activities, and hopefully we'll have something to report at the annual meeting in terms of things that occurred. But what it did was it basically shut the fishery down for the rest of the state out of the north, except for the northeast. And then as a result of the concerns over the summer in the warm weather of the potential for this year class that we're seeing in North Carolina and Virginia that's bigger than anything we've ever seen, the commercial industry actually came forward and asked for me to close the gillnet fisheries in inside waters where drum occur. So the gillnet fishery's been closed in North Carolina since I believe around May 15th, and it will remain closed until September 1st in areas where red drum occur. So that certainly was a huge reduction in any kind of discard mortality with those nets out of the water and the fishery closed. So I've got a proclamation ready that I'm going to review with my commission in a couple of weeks. I'm going to reopen the fishery September 1, but I'm going to lower the trip limit and require specific species to be caught with the bycatch to try to avoid any future overages. But we have already in the proclamation, it reduces the 150,000 pound fall quota by the overage that Kirby reported. I think it was about 12 or 13,000 pounds. So we've handled all that. I think we're in good stead. We took a lot of efforts to make sure we didn't have a lot of dead discarded red drum, and we are starting to see more and more frequent large year classes of red drum moving through the fishery with the expansion of the spawning stock biomass, or the presumed expansion of the spawning stock biomass. So thank you. I just wanted to prepare that, and then to save you some time, I'll make a motion that we accept the de minimis request from Delaware and New Jersey.
Lewis, would you like to add the approval of the compliance reports as well to that motion?
Sure. Yeah, I'll approve the compliance reports and the de minimis requests for Delaware and New Jersey.
Okay. And Robert will second it. Robert Boyle seconds it. And let's get it up there. Marty, did you have something? Did you have your hand raised?
I just wanted to ask Kirby, I may have missed it, but was there a release mortality rate assigned to red drum in the recreational sector?
I believe it's 8%.
Yeah, that's what it was. It was 8%. Okay. Any other discussion? All right. I'll read the motion and move to approve the compliance reports and accept the minimis requests for Delaware and New Jersey. Motion by Dr. Daniel, second by Mr. Boyle. Seeing no opposition, consider it approved. Okay. All right. All right, item number 7 is the red drum stock assessment is in the process. It's just starting up. It's going to be done next year, and we need to talk about the terms of reference, and Jeff's going to give us that information.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'll be going over the terms of reference for the 2015 red drum benchmark stock assessment, as well as a proposed timeline for that assessment. So if you recall, there's 2 sets of terms of reference, one to guide the stock assessment and a second set to guide the peer review. And this peer review will be coordinated by CDAR. And these were developed by the Red Drum Technical Committee and Stock Assessment Subcommittee. So first I'll go over the terms of reference for the stock assessment. If possible, identify and prepare new data that could be used to inform the assessment of adult and/or spawning stock trends. Characterize precision and accuracy of fishery-dependent and fishery-independent data considered for the assessment, including the following but not limited to: provide descriptions of each data source, describe calculations and potential standardization of abundance indices, discuss trends and associated estimates of uncertainty, justify inclusion or elimination of available data sources, discuss the effects of data strengths and weaknesses on model inputs and outputs, define and justify definition of stock structure, review recreational fishing estimates and PSEs, compare historical and current data collection and estimation procedures, and describe data caveats that may affect the assessment. Estimate discards and size composition of discards in recreational and commercial fisheries where possible. Evaluate the effects of stock enhancement program contributions on data inputs. Develop models used to estimate population parameters and biological reference points and analyze model performance. Describe stability of the model. Assess estimated selectivity and discuss effects on population parameters. Justify choices of CVs, effective sample sizes, and/or likelihood weighting schemes. Perform sensitivity analyses for starting parameter values, priors, etc., and conduct other model diagnostics as necessary. Clearly and thoroughly explain model strengths and limitations. Briefly describe history of model usage, its theory and framework, and document associated peer review literature. If using a new model, test using simulated data. If model structure differs from the model structure used in the previous assessment, perform a continuity run of the previous model and compare estimates. Discuss potential causes of any observed discrepancies. If multiple models were considered, justify the choice of preferred model and the explanation of any differences in results among models. State assumptions made for all models and explain the likely effects of assumption violations on synthesis of input data and model outputs. Example of assumptions may include choice of stock recruit function, choice to use constant or time-varying natural mortality or catchability, choice of a plus group, constant ecosystem conditions. Characterize uncertainty of model estimates and biological or empirical reference points. Perform retrospective analyses, assess magnitude and direction of retrospective patterns detected, and discuss implications of any observed retrospective patterns for uncertainty in population parameters, reference points, and/or management measures. Recommend stock status as related to reference points. For example, is the spawning potential ratio above or below the 30% spawning potential ratio threshold. Other potential scientific issues, if possible, assess any temporal changes in distribution of stock structure, discuss potential causes of any changes. Compare reference points derived in this assessment with what is known about the general life history of the exploited stock, explain any inconsistencies. If a minority report has been filed, explain majority reasoning against adopting approach suggested in that report. The minority report should explain reasoning against adopting an approach suggested by the majority. Develop detailed short and long-term prioritized lists of recommendations for future research, data collection, and assessment methodology. Highlight improvements to be made by next benchmark review. And recommend timing of next benchmark assessment and intermediate updates, if necessary, relative to the biology and current management of red drum. Now I'll just quickly go through the terms of reference for the peer review. These are very similar to what I just went through, only they're for the peer review to evaluate essentially what we were guided to do in the stock assessment. Evaluate the thoroughness of data collection and the presentation and treatment of fishery-dependent and fishery-independent data in the assessment, including the following but not limited to: presentation of data source variance, justification for inclusion or elimination of available data sources, consideration of data strengths and weaknesses, calculation and/or standardization of abundance indices, and estimation of discards and size composition of discards. Evaluate the definition of stock structure used in the assessment. Evaluate the methods and models used to estimate population parameters and biological reference points, including but not limited to. Evaluate the choice and justification of preferred models. If multiple models were considered, evaluate the analyst's explanation of any differences in results. Evaluate model parameterization and specification. Evaluate the diagnostic analyses performed, including but not limited to sensitivity analyses to determine model stability and potential consequences of major model assumptions, and retrospective analyses. Evaluate the methods used to characterize uncertainty in estimated parameters. Ensure that the implications of uncertainty in technical conclusions are clearly stated. If a minority report has been filed, review minority opinion and any associated analyses. If possible, make recommendation on current or future use of alternative assessment approach presented in the minority report. Recommend best estimates of stock biomass, abundance, and exploitation from the assessment for use in management, if possible, or specify alternative estimation methods. Evaluate the choice of reference points and the methods used to estimate them. Recommend stock status determination from the assessment, or if appropriate, specify alternative methods or measures. Review the research, data collection, and assessment methodology recommendations provided by the TC and make any additional recommendations warranted. Clearly prioritize the activities needed to inform and maintain the current assessment and provide recommendations to improve the reliability of future assessments. Recommend timing of the next benchmark assessment and updates, if necessary, relative to the life history and current management of red drum. Prepare a peer review panel terms of reference and advisory report summarizing the panel's evaluation of the stock assessment and addressing each peer review term of reference. Develop a list of tasks to be completed following the workshop. Complete and submit the report within 4 weeks of workshop conclusion. And now I'll just go over the stock assessment timeline that was proposed for the assessment. A few of these items have already occurred. We had a planning call on May 7th to discuss data submission, data formatting, and data procedures. We had a call on June 12th to lay the groundwork for planning the stock assessment. We agreed to a data submission deadline this past Friday, August 1st. And we've set the data workshop, which will be attended by the technical committee and the stock assessment subcommittee, for October 14th through the 17th. Following the data workshop, we plan on an assessment workshop sometime in January or February of 2015. And the assessment report deadline to have that ready for the peer reviewers is set at August 1st for that CDAR review workshop, which is on the schedule for August 25th through the 27th. And following that workshop, assessment reports, including the peer review report, will be finalized for a target date of October 1st. And so that's all I had. If there are any questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
Lewis.
Don't smile, Kirby. I'm wondering that maybe get some board discussion on this issue. I'm not exactly sure how to handle it, but I do feel like I need to bring it up. And what kind of dawned on me during the presentation was the plus group talk. And, you know, at least in the northern region, we're seeing incredible abundance of red drum during certain times, during certain years, and it has been consistently going up. And there's a lot of people that are starting to squirm a little bit in terms of the discards that we're seeing and the need or the want to be able to harvest more fish. And clearly we don't want to do that until we have some assurances from the technical committee that we're, at a recovered state, or whatever the facts, however we're going to characterize the fishery. But right now, I don't know that we really have an idea on what would be a recovered red drum fishery. I mean, I don't know if we expect 60-year classes to be in the fishery before we declare it recovered. If we do, we just need to let the public know that. But I think we've got about 15 year classes, maybe 16. that have been protected at around the 30 to 40% escapement rate. That's pretty extraordinary. And so maybe I just would kind of like to get some sense from the technical committee as they do the assessment. If we come back again with a 40+% escapement rate in the northern region, I mean, would it be possible to declare them recovered and start to manage them as a recovered stock, as opposed to continuing to list them as overfishing or overfished and maintaining these restrictive measures that are resulting in fishery closures? So it's how do you manage it's the age-old problem that we've always had is how to manage a recovered stock. But I also don't want to jump the gun and say it's recovered, but there are a lot of people looking at that, and that'll be a big issue that arises during the stock assessment, and maybe if we have some feedback from the peer reviewers and the technical committee, that would be helpful.
If you want to answer that.
Yeah, I think that'll certainly depend on our ability, the stock assessment subcommittee's ability to reliably estimate biomass, which, if you recall back to the previous estimate, was a huge difficulty there. But that will in turn rely on whether or not some certain data limitations for the adult portion of the stock have been addressed adequately since the past assessment, which we're hopeful it has been. But to our ability to, I think, determine whether the stock is rebuilt or recovered will rely on some reliable biomass estimates.
Follow-up, please.
Yeah, and again, I don't want to get into the debate right now, but that's not the way we started with Red Drum. I mean, when I first started working on Red Drum, they were at 0.3% SPR or escapement, and now they're consistently over 40. And the concept in the original plan and in Amendment 1, and I think 2, was that the escapement rate was a proxy for SPR, which is a biomass estimate. And I don't know that I don't think that's no longer true. Yeah, we'd love to have the biomass estimates, but I don't think the board's ever expected that we would delay any positive rebuilding recovery projections if we didn't have a biomass estimate. And because we may still not have one, but yet if we're still getting the 40% consistently over time, then the assumption by the technical committees of the past was we'd ultimately get to a 40% SPR. So the big question is 15 years enough? Do we need 20? Do we need 30? What's a generation time? Is 2 generation times sufficient? On a very long-lived fish, and certainly we declared striped bass recovered and have had some oopsie moments. So I don't want to do anything like that, but at least know that there's going to be a lot of calls if we're above 40% again to try to do something and avoid these closures on a stock that's recovering so nicely. At least in the northern region. I can't really speak to the southern region, but I know in the northern region we've had some real issues with them this year. So I understand what you're saying. I just bring it up as a point, as sort of a heads up, that if we can get some technical advice on this, it would be good. If it comes back exactly what you just said, then that's the advice. But I hope that we would have some of our state folks be a little more thoughtful about how we may answer those public questions, because that's going to be the big question that comes out of this assessment. If we come back and say status quo on management actions, and we're at 40% again, Virginia and North Carolina, I'm assuming Virginia and certainly North Carolina is going to have some problems. So,
Yeah, I have Wilson and I have Robert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to ask, I guess, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. I know we designed that bottom long line survey to try and get at, some sort of an offshore index of adult abundance. I guess I haven't heard an update lately. So did we generate the information with that survey that's going to help the technical committee gain some insight into that question?
I can tell you from the Georgia perspective, the answer is no. Been vast amounts of effort exerted, and we're producing great information on sharks. But I think there's going to be very little to come out of that survey that's going to have any positive effect on this next assessment. I mean, it just continues to be the holy grail of red drum management that we can't seem to find.
But in contrast, North Carolina is being very successful with that survey for red drum. So it's, and South Carolina is in between those two scenarios. Follow up, Wilson?
Well, yeah, I guess I've read a little bit in the popular press about, Chris Taylor's work with NIMS and doing some of the, or I guess not NIMS, it's NOS, but in doing some of the survey work for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management in those wind call areas off North Carolina, using some electronic approaches to monitoring fish biomass. And I was just wondering if anybody knows whether or not that's sophisticated enough at this point to be able to use something like that to monitor red drum biomass. I guess it would depend on whether or not you got a distinctive enough signature to be able to tell that you were looking at red drum and not some other species. And I don't know whether that's the case or not, but it's something we might want to ask our NOS colleagues to address in a future meeting, maybe. Lewis may know more about that.
Yeah, that would be difficult to do, and I think because a lot of times the signatures are dependent on the swim bladders. But I mean, I can tell you in North Carolina, Pat's right. We've been pretty successful in catching them. But the other thing that we're seeing, and I don't know if y'all are seeing it down in the southern areas, but we're starting to see these big schools of red drum. I mean, acres of them that are all the big adult, 30-plus pound fish up and down the beach. And I mean, even occurring in areas where we've never heard of those fish occurring. But especially between the capes, we're seeing huge numbers of really big red drum. Nothing like we've ever seen before anywhere else. I mean, every now and then you'd see one that would make the newspaper. Now it's a pretty common event. And they're different schools. And you can see them from the air. It's easy to find them.
Robert, you had a comment?
I did. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Speaking from the southern perspective, I'll start out by saying, based on a lot of effort on our staff's part, we know a lot more about red drum now than we did even 5 years ago. Recruitment bottlenecks, barriers to recruitment, more about life history, and I'm very proud of that. But I will say we've seen a number of poor year classes in the southern portion. So, this bifurcation, the reason for the bifurcation, I don't know. I could certainly speculate, but I think that's something we're going to have to come to grips with. I think I'd mentioned this in an earlier email to staff. I think, and it's probably something for us to discuss here, following on Dr. Daniels' comments, that I think we need to come to grips with the question of what does success look like in recruitment. We have had some success at looking at those adults in the offshore spawning population. We see some signatures in the data that suggest that that they're seeing escapement into the breeding population, and that to us has always been a very, very good sign. But with a species like this in the southern region is 34 years old, I believe, 35-year-old fish. It takes a long time to correct for the sins of the past, and so I think we need to really come to grips, because Lewis is right. I mean, our constituents on good years are asking, hey, what can we do? On poor years like this year, the question is what do we need to do? And I think we owe it to our constituents that we provide some kind of predictability and stability in the management process. So don't know what that looks like, but certainly would value the wisdom of the group. Thanks.
Joe, you had a comment?
I was just going to follow up on what Dr. Daniels said. We're seeing a similar trend in our waters between Cape Henry and Cape Charles, both from spotter planes and from the recreational anglers, about just huge masses of adult bull reds out there. They can pretty much, once you find them, they can fill up on a citation it's the easiest thing in the world to go out and get a trophy-sized fish quickly out there these days, this time of year. Just mats of them everywhere. They seem to be bouncing between the two capes there as well, just as what Lewis is seeing down toward Carolina. So it's not just Carolina. We're seeing it in the lower part of Virginia as well.
Spud?
Maybe to help focus some of the future efforts of the technical folks is, I'd like to see a fresh look at, we've established a biological reference point to rebuild something, a long-lived species. Is that same reference point appropriate for sustaining a long-lived species? To me, I'd like to see that kind of fresh look at it. Lewis and me, we've been doing this a long time, and it'd be nice to have some look at it, because I know when we all started adopting these 40% SPRs, there was a lot of question then. Is it the most appropriate thing for all species? And I think that we would all benefit from a fresh take on that, because if we're going to have a different reference point for a sustained, viable, whatever we're going to end up calling them, it'd be nice to know that, because that's going to play into our discussions and how do we deal with using the benefits of a rebuilt stock.
Any other comments? All right. Do we want to include these comments in the terms of reference, or do we just want to note them? Robert?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was going to ask staff for some guidance, because I think these are critical elements, but I sense we're at an inflection point. Some of these things, I think necessarily the question I asked, what does success look like? I think it's a policy question. I could certainly use the benefit and the wisdom of the technical committee, but I don't know that that's a term of reference necessarily. But I think that's certainly something for us to come to grips with, and I would look to staff, Tony, maybe on how we move the needle on this discussion.
Tony?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just conferring with Pat, and I think that what we can do is try to do some runs that vary around some different SPR rates that would help give you all some guidance on how to make that policy decision on how you want to define success and go from there. Does that work? And I think that works within the realm of the terms of reference that we have identified here, and then we have these comments that we can bring back to the SAS as they work on the assessment and the technical committee as well.
Everybody okay with that? All right, well, we need to approve these terms of reference, so Mr. Woodward.
I'll make the motion that we approve the terms of reference for the red drum stock assessment as presented.
Second by Joe Grest. Let's get this up on the board so I can read it for Joe. All right. You're good with that, Joe? All right. Any more comments on this? Any opposition? And all right. Move to, oh, that's the old one. Okay. We'll consider this approved. The terms of reference for the stock assessment. Okay. Moving on. Any other business? None? Well, what? Say again? You can adjourn and then I have it. Oh, okay. Hearing none, meeting is adjourned.
We do have national